Let's start with the idea of the state of Christianity today. So, you are currently pastoring a church, you have been for years. Um, I've read from some of the deep thinkers that we are at the end of a cycle, end of an era of Christianity, just like the end of a civilization. Not that it is over, but that something new has to take place. And it makes me think of B.D. Griffith, the great English monk who lived in India, who said, if Christianity does not recover its mystical dimension, it should pack up and go out of business. What are your thoughts on that?
I concur 100% with him, and I've ever since you told me that quote years ago, that has stuck in my mind because it's something that drives me. I feel very compelled to stay within the church, even though it is struggling greatly because of this reason, because it has been cut off from its spiritual roots. And I have been able to reconnect with those roots, not through Protestantism, even though I'm a United Church of Christ pastor. My roots are in United Methodism, and you and I both grew up in that in the mainline Christianity in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and it's when I went to seminary, and I was hungry. I was hungry for a deeper experience, and I didn't even know what that was. I just knew that there was a hunger. It's very much like the Matrix, you know, in terms of that movie, that you know something is there, you know there's something more to life. You're tired of going through the motions, and you see a church that is basically just a club. The church has turned into just another club. And unless we rediscover these roots, which is what I continue to preach constantly through my videos and through really following your teaching and Charles Ashton and Robin Amos, until I found meditation, I was empty. Until I utilized the Jesus prayer through the Getmans as through their books that have taught me, and through Robin Amos, I didn't know what the early church fathers were talking about, and had this hunger that continued to drive me. Was it something similar with your walk, because you've got such a rich history in the Fourth Way? Did you have to venture outside the church in order to come back in the church to find some relevancy? And if so, you know, you and I both, I've done a lot of social work and worked in a jail setting and worked with the homeless, mentally ill. Now here I am back in a pastoral setting. You've kind of had that same way too. What's been your experience in terms of trying to find that vitality of the inner life outside the church setting?
I was one of those who, in the 70s, definitely had to leave the church to go find meaning, answers, depth. I came out of a mainline Protestant church that was very politically motivated, very rationalist, and really didn't at any point touch the soul in any way that resonated, that gave that hunger, you know. I remember the summer of my 16th year, I went to Thésée, the Protestant monastic community, and that was my first real exposure to contemplative silence. And I spoke to the brothers and discovered within me a whole new dimension that had not been generated by the church I grew up in. So I knew it was there. And my father, when I was a child, took me to monasteries and cathedrals, and I instinctively sensed something. But Protestantism of that era was so dry, so devoid of it, and as I later discovered, aggressively against the inner life. Now, you know, perhaps in various pockets that's changing, but the old guard and the mindset of the leadership and even the form is such that it doesn't invite to the kind of humility, inner silence, mystical experience that is at the heart of Christianity. And discovering the mystics of the Catholic Church and then the Orthodox Church uh, made me realize that the whole point was to soak us, drown us in a tangible dimension that is not of this world and yet allows us to function in the world as enlightened people. And as a pastor, I brought in many seekers who were willing to overlook a form that they had long rejected as I had. But in the long run, I found that the form created too much of an obstacle for a long-term spiritual journey, however radical one was with it. Now, for me, the bridge back in from my journey into Eastern teachings, into esotericism, and ultimately into Gurdjieff and the Fourth Way, was through Thomas Merton in particular. He, through his masterful New Seeds of Contemplation especially, spoke in that lucid way that only one of the great writers on spirituality can speak, revealing to me that all of the practices and efforts towards higher consciousness that I recognized as transformative were present in the Christian way, and that it was all about that kind of awakening and expansive experience, regardless of what the external religion that we all grew up with presented. The issue is whether one can go back into the church with that knowledge, call upon its legacy, and revive it. That was my journey, for decades. And where I find myself now is that my revival, if you will, of linking the mystical legacy with spiritual seekers who've been burnt by Christianity is through the internet. In other words, outside of form. And even outside of community, although we create virtual communities, because communities tend, for all the good that they also tend to be hierarchical, go rigid, the social club thing, the social club and worse. The takeover of power of people who've been around for a while and think of it not as the Church of Jesus Christ, but as my church, and just cut off anything that they don't understand or that is different. But I think also of Europe and the empty grand churches there and the movement of several generations completely out of their cultural roots of Catholic upbringing to go to India and find something else because they've given up on it. All of that leads us to a place where we are historically at a crucial moment where Christianity has been hijacked by ignorance, literalism, manipulation, power, and for it to be found by those who've given up on it requires a real creative approach for a new era, really. And you and I know that within the churches we have found authentic mystics, Charles, the Goatman, even Robin, who were, but even they were outsiders in their own church. Charles himself, 1,200 years of orthodoxy in his blood, and he was still.
He was a liberal in the Orthodox Church. I mean, really, yeah, he struggled. He greatly struggled with that and struggled in Protestantism. And, he always felt like he was in exile. And to some extent, so am I. And you can speak for yourself, but I feel that way. I feel exiled from my spiritual homeland. Um, I feel exiled even within my own church to some extent. And yet that does not drive me away from what I feel is my own personal calling. And my calling was very powerful when I was 22, and I had a spiritual experience before I even knew what was going on. And within 6 months, I had met Charles and really was on a path, um, a very mythological um, path where people were actually physical signposts for me. I mean, they were actually there saying, "Go this way, go that way, go slow, be careful." And I'm a big fan of Joseph Campbell in the mythological sense that there's really only one truth. And even Robin Amos told me one time there can only be one truth. So there's the sense that, is Christianity dead? And I really asked those questions. And I even looked into Nietzsche, and I looked into some of these writers, the existentialists, to say, is it so dead? Is the church so dead and Christianity so dead? Maybe it's time to move on out into the wilderness, the spiritual wilderness. And I was comforted by Nietzsche. You don't hear that very often. But I was comforted because he said there will always be room for Christians. And he believed there was only one true Christian, Jesus Christ. But he even wrote there will always be room because it's authentic, and it's an authentic faith. And what I needed to do, instead of going away from it, I needed to stay. And I needed to be almost a missionary within Protestantism in order to be able to create safe space within churches, even though they're extremely toxic. The church that I'm in now is beautiful, beautiful church, beautiful people, and I'm not having any issues with any of that. But brother, I have had some issues in churches before, and very demonic issues, and very, very frightening issues in terms of just people possessing it. And like you said, just, this is my place and you can't come in here. And really the gospel and the message of liberation that Christ brings was almost like a pair, just they reacted to it in terms of it being a foreign object, and it needed to be expelled from the body. And it was attacked. And um,
I had a case where someone had a problem with the word transformation. I don't know if we've spoken about that before, but
mm,
a lifetime in church, they'd never heard the word transformation, and that
I've
really
never heard of
worried
it.
them. And they actually approached me and said, "What is this word? I've not heard it used before." The idea of change, which is so fundamental from the old man to the new. I mean, it's right there.
I mean, I talked one time in a sermon about the Christ within, this archetypal sense of Christ within us. And I immediately was tagged as a new age preacher.
Mhm.
This Matthew Fox guy that's just way out there. And just just so many things that to some extent I just had to search for it on my own. And that's what you and I have sought, is this own spiritual transformation within our own lives, but really being led to realizing that this message, that there is life within Christianity, there is hope here, there is a chance to find the meditative practices that you find in the Eastern religions. There it is present and always has been present within Christianity, and that's why these signposts, the Charles Ashnans and the Robin Amoses and you and the Getmans, they all have been there for me to say, this is the way. And once I found that, I have never looked back, because it is the thing that continues to give me a foundation, and that's what I continue to talk about. And it's not like people are just like grabbing it up like hotcakes. I mean, it's this is a tough road to go, because it takes a lot of introspection and a lot of examination of your conscience. I'm preaching about that Sunday, about your conscience, and how you have to have your conscience awakened before consciousness. And this, it is a lifelong journey. And we, especially as Americans, think that it's just this,
Mhm.
just watch a webinar and I should be able to get a certificate
Right.
and I should be able to have it. And there is a price to pay if
Yeah.
you want to be Christ-like.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's the reality of the great legacy of the ancient church that belongs to all of us. And I've been fascinated for a long time at the historical devolution of all of that and how we end up on the American frontier, completely cut off from all roots, not just the European roots that we came from, but
Yes.
the original Christian roots are so far removed that it's hopelessly disconnected, which is why we have the insanity that we see on television passing for Christianity. Or for that matter, the Pentecostal approach, which started in what 1911 in Toledo. I mean
Right.
or Topeka, Kansas, I should say. With an associate Methodist pastor looking for meaning. And they had nothing to go on, so they found it for themselves, and it couldn't possibly be uh, from the depths of the original teachings of the great traditions that St. John Chrysostom would have spoken to, and countless others, because none of that existed. None of that was in the English language. Uh, I may have said this before, but in 1972, I'm told there were 2 books in English on orthodoxy. And thanks to Father Seraphim Rose, now there's this marvelous library of all the, of centuries of great teachers that stir the heart and soul and reveal to us a path, a methodology, a richness of being that is completely non-existent in Protestantism. The Quakers went looking for something, but they had nothing to build from. The Catholic Church has, so cut itself off. It amazes me that to this day on the radio, I'll hear a scholarly Catholic priest say that we are the original church, we're the ancient church, as though there's no such thing as orthodoxy, and immediately remove Saint Seraphim of Sarov, Saint Simeon the New Theologian, all of these that belong to us and that we need to reclaim, and that changes everything, because it's all about experiential transformation. It's all about this theosis that is so foreign to us still. And of course, this has to be translated for our times. And that's perhaps the key here for the reawakening of what Christianity really is. It's not the corner church that your grandmother went to, that uh, in the case of the Christian church was part of that event, where they went to claim land in the 1800s, and that's where they planted the flag. That's where the local church started, and that's the tradition. To recognize that it's so much bigger, so much richer, and that so many of our associations are inaccurate. It amazes me that Protestants assume certain things that are medieval Catholic, but that just came down unreflected on, and end up deteriorating into gruesome ideas, like being born evil and things like that, which is the ultimate uh, perversion of St. Augustine's original sin, which itself was not accurately expressed from the first ideas of the original church. Ancestral sin without that guilt and personal element to it. So there's so much to look, revisit, and experience in a new way without the associations that people have to the language. And that in itself is a great challenge for our time because the walls are so high. There are so many wounded people.
Yeah, and that's one of the things the church, to some extent, is a spiritual hospital, and that's to some extent what I feel called to do is just to be here and to try to create safe space, safe sacred space for people to come and heal and um, find out that there is really an inner life here that if you this is what you were pursuing, because there are a lot of people out there who have heard hints of this, whispers of it.
Mhm.
It is true that there is an inner life within Christianity that is exactly, you know, like Zen Buddhism. I mean, there is a path that we always heard of, but I never heard of it until I got to seminary. I mean, I spent 22 years in the church being a preacher's kid and hearing my dad preach and hearing about John Wesley and all this stuff. And I had never even heard of it. So when I met Charles Ashton, it just blew me away, and I was like, "This is the guy. This is him. This is who I need to follow." And I didn't care what. I knew that I the reason I went to Christian Theological Seminary was not because of Clark Williamson and Dick Dickinson. It was because of Charles Ashton.
Mhm.
Ashton was the reason I went there, and that's why he was the heart of that place,
Mhm.
and he was so disrespected and so arrogantly looked down upon, um, because, and to some extent, not to be too negative, to some extent, Protestantism just basically thinks that the church started with Martin Luther. Basically, we'll show you guys how to do it. We'll show you how to do it. And, especially the first, 800, 900 years didn't even happen.
Mhm. Mhm.
Didn't even happen. Except St. Augustine. That was the only one they would quote. That's it. And he was the Western version, the only one.
Mhm.
So when I found Charles, and that's why I'm sharing things on videos about Charles, and that's why I've written those books about Charles, because that is something that resonated with me. Yes, there is an inner life. Yes, there is peace. Yes, there is an answer to why my mind wanders when I try to preach. When Paul says to pray without ceasing, the fact that no one besides Charles Ashton and then, Robin and then you and the Getmans, the fact that no one had an answer to that was not fair. That is not acceptable to me. What does it mean to pray without ceasing? You mean I just have to repeat prayers over and over and over again through my mouth? No, that's not what that means. And the fact that that teaching has been disconnected with our religion is a travesty. And that's one of the things that you and I work hard at in terms of trying to, let people know that there is a way to pray without ceasing.
Well, one of the summits for me of wisdom discovery through the Gottmans was in their book, Wisdom and Practices of the Ancient Faith, when they bring together, when they marry together the vigilance, attention, and prayer as becoming one. Conscious, attentive presence becomes prayer. That's something that is a whole new ballgame and brings together all of these traditions about mindfulness, self-awareness that we find in all the great philosophies and religious teachings with that very Christian element of prayer. And to me, that's a quantum leap right there. When the simple thing of attention becomes a matter of connection with the holy and of an inner state that is prayerful and receptive, then we have a new human being walking the streets, you know. And that's the hope of humanity right there. So many obstacles stand in the way. One of them, I think, is the joyful, open-minded, eclectic approach to all the religions. You know, truth is one, therefore it's all the same. And I recently had to deal with someone about that, you know, who questioned, well, you know, why do you say Christianity is unique? Because that seems to raise it above other things. To me, the Christ revelation of the nature of God is the summit of humanity's potential experience of the divine. That doesn't take away from Lao Tzu and Sufism and all of that, and Rumi's great ecstatic love. And perhaps there is a unity there for sure. But nevertheless, that intimacy of Abba with the cosmic one that penetrates everything that we are throughout our humanness, throughout our weaknesses, throughout our spirit being, in a way that no other teaching reveals it. Not to speak of this self-giving, self-sacrificing compassion and mercy, you know, which we find with the bodhisattvas and others. It's very beautiful, but when that laser beam focus on the holy coming through you in that act of unconditional love, there is something of Jesus specifically modeling, being the first fruit of many, of that kind of way of the heart. And that can dissolve immediately if everything's on the same level. You know, we can honor the great intuitions, but we must find that which is that pearl, that treasure that is unique to not Christianity, but to Jesus of Nazareth, Logos, and his unique impact on the world. And we have to part the curtains of history. We have to forget about the Crusades, all those horrors. That's not an excuse, because none of that was spiritual anyway. You know, that was just a sign of how it had been despoiled. And why be surprised with what human beings do to pure goodness and pure teachings? But we find the saints, we find the great elders, we find those individuals who did carry that light. You know, in Orthodoxy, there's the idea of the uncreated light coming through some individuals, even, as we know. Now, there's a non-Western thought for you.
Yeah.
And that's what Christianity really is. Ultimate mystical experience, because it's about the uncreated incarnating in a human being and in all human beings who open themselves to it. And there are very few people who can shift off of their assumptions of what Christianity is to rediscover it on a level unimaginable to them. That's where Orthodoxy has been very helpful to me, because it completely pulls you out of the culture and puts you in another world. In that incense, bowing before the icons, the whole physicality of it, the state of mind shift. We may have said this before in other places, but to be in that sanctuary, in the divine liturgy, and to hear the police sirens outside for a moment, you know, you suddenly become aware there's that world on 16th Street. Yeah. All it does is make you realize what, you know, that you've gone through a wormhole, that you're in a whole other dimension, which will go out to the world and help it, but is completely unrelated to what the world thinks reality is. And that's what needs to suffuse human lives I was going to say society, that will never happen because it has to be one human being at a time. We know that even in Orthodoxy, which is the carrier of this ultimate mystical tradition, there is rigidity, intolerance, mean-spiritedness, political infighting, all of the same old, because humans will default to their lower selves. So the focus that we put, and that Charles, Robin, the Gottmans, George Maloney, so many other wonderful people that we have personally known, on that real discipline, and return to actively working on one's inner being, one's cleansing, one's purification, one's transparency to the divine, is what's going to keep all this reality emerging, represent Christianity in a new way.